Welcome to Module 3 of the Protection and Malefica course. This is one of the free modules, as previously mentioned. And as a special surprise, I think it's the first time ever, I have a co-pilot for this module. And it is, of course, the one and only Peter Gray from Scarlet Imprint. Peter, how are you doing?
Doing well. Pleasure to be with you for this, Gordon.
Absolutely. I couldn't think of anyone better because, and I'm just going to bring up the slides. Where we are in the course at the moment, I think I mentioned this in the last free module, is the first third is about protection, and we've just kind of finished that up amongst the membership. And the middle third is what I'm calling like the morality of intervention and situating the morality of intervention. And I kind of mean it in the broader sense of how and where we intervene when it comes to magic and practical enchantment. But because it's a protection and Malefica course, I think the best way to interrogate intervention is when we look at something like Malefica. And there is a document that is near and dear to both our hearts that I think is a really good place to begin that exploration. And one of the reasons why I want this to be one of the free modules, same with module 0, is this discussion fits in the Protection and Malefica course, but it's also medicinally useful in a wider context. So I want this one to reach people outside the membership because it is, I would say, it's almost like a cornerstone piece of our quote unquote our lineage in the quote unquote West. Challenging terms, but nevertheless it's true, right? So there's some repositioning that happened with Jack Parsons in the mid-20th century, which has been a big part of your work over the last decade. And this document, I think, is one of the important ways both in and out of that. And it's called We Are The Witchcraft. So that's what we'll be discussing. And I'm looking forward to it. Righty. So as I said, we're going to begin by situating what I'm calling a morality of intervention, which is kind of like a really $5 word way of saying it. And I'm happy with that. And then I want to look at different perspectives on Malefica because this is a Rune Soup course, which means we will be doing, as we always do, global comparison, right? And then a bit of a background to We Are The Witchcraft, and then we'll examine the text. And then I'm going to ask you what we do with said text by the time we get to it. So, situating a morality of intervention. And I mean that, so I want to start with that intellectually and from a lineage perspective. And by lineage, I mean a Western lineage, which means we have to talk about, is there one? And where is it from the current? And is there more than one? And is there one that's universally available and so on? Because I think that's the key. People kind of, in the absence of finding a lineage or a current, the takes get really, really bad. Certainly at the moment, the takes are generally bad at this point in the timeline regardless, but there's some stuff that I find frustrating, mildly frustrating, actually on one level don't care, out there in the wider internet and app space. And the two big ones that I think we need to provide a necessary counter to is the sort of, I don't think people realize just kind of like how weirdly racist it is to say, cursing is our culture, or cursing is part of my culture, is this sort of declarative statement by a 17-year-old on TikTok, a white 17-year-old to be clear. And actually, it's basically not at all right because you're pulling something out of something that could be right if you didn't pull it out, right? So cursing isn't your culture, but there is a lineage that you can step into. And so there's that's what I mean by we need to kind of situate this discussion. So what do you think, like, how do we think with a morality of intervention in like a quote unquote Western context? So how do you, like, do you know what I mean?
In terms of my personal work or in terms of...
Yeah, a bit of both, right? Because obviously it's going to overlap with the historical work and so on. But like how... let me put it this way. What are the rules? We'll start clunky and then get nuanced. What are the rules of cursing in the West?
What are the rules of cursing in the West? It's a huge question, Gordon. No, I need a bit more granularity than that. That's just I'm
Right.
just
Okay.
lost
So,
on the scale of that.
it is right. We Are the Witchcraft is a mid-20th century text that predates Gerald Gardner. So it's actually there's a morality of intervening and a sort of statement of politics and freedom that predates the beginning of Wicca, and of course it predates the beginning of Wicca, because as we both know, Wicca is downstream from a jailbroken Thelema, which is the point of something like Jack Parsons and We Are the Witchcraft. So we actually have a statement in the mid-20th century that predates the rule of three and it hummed on stuff that we all had to kind of like crawl out of at the end of the 20th century. And here we are in the 21st century. And whilst we seem to have, and you know, blessed be for this, moved past that rule of three stuff, we've moved past it into this kind of TikTok, cursing is my culture, or taking pictures of feathers and putting it on Instagram and pretending you're cursing a president. And I'm like, I'm glad we've moved out of the rule of three stuff. I'm not happy with where we've ended up. So I think one of the reasons is that we haven't sat with the it's a clunky term, what the rules of cursing are, right?
Well, let's first break rule of three. Rule of three is really only makes sense when you understand that Gardner was operating in an environment where he was trying to make witchcraft more socially acceptable. So although you say at the start that that Gardner is downstream of Thelema and Wicca is downstream of Thelema, it's pretty clear from the latest evidence that he was initiated into a witch coven of some sort. And when we look at the pre-Gardnerian history of witchcraft in England, which is by its very nature fragmentary, what we find is a variety of small groups who were engaged in various forms of witchcraft on a village level. Some of those groups appear to be middle class and reconstructionists. Some of them may have older roots, but all of those things are pretty shaky ground. I spent a long time crawling through the backish editions of the Cauldron in the Museum of Witchcraft, and it's very clear that an idea of a traditional witchcraft survival in England is really pulled together from a whole range of folkloric pieces, and that there was never a really coherent witchcraft in England, and that these things are very specific and very local. Although there's quite a lot of materia. So again, going back to Boscastle and going through the museum cabinets, you find that there's quite a lot of cursing technology that's going on in there. But those items, thinking, for example, of some shoe curses that they have there, and some doll curses that they have there, they all appear to be sort of 1930s, 1940s. As far as you can tell, and some of the more famous looking things like mandrake coffins and working with mandrake roots, they look as if they've really been kind of made to order at some stage. I'm not sure that those are actually live objects from any like cultic witchcraft behavior. So pre-Gardner, there was obviously people were resorting to witchcraft and Malefica, and quite a lot of the understanding of witchcraft pre-Gardner was that it was concerned with the malefic rather than the benefic. Witchcraft had a much blacker reputation, and Cecil Williamson is very famous for giving some kind of hair-raising television interviews about this and saying, you don't want to get involved with witches because they're all murderers.
This is an oversimplification, but it's an important one, and it comes back to one of my favorite of your lines, which I use all the time, which is, "You will find the witch at the end of a pointed finger." We one of the things people need to square with one way or the other, and in Jack's case, and for people who kind of find medicine in We Are the Witchcraft, it is stepping into that label. But the reality is, oversimplification, but it's useful for what we're talking about now, is that the cunning traditions, so a cunning man or a cunning woman, would not refer to themselves as a witch, and in fact would refer to their competition as witches. You don't want to go to her, she's a witch, right? And so you end up, when we look for the lineage of it, and witchcraft is in the doing, and it's specifically what you were saying there, in the doing of Malefica, right? Like a witch is a cunning person who curses their neighbor, rather than a witch is someone who practices cunning traditions. And that's kind of what I want. Like, you know what I mean? I want people to see the lineage is in the doing of Malefica. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and as we can see, that's something that is a common human heritage.
Yes. This is at the level at which you can compare universally, rather than comparing on the level of, well, what are the beings they're interacting with. It's always at the level of doing, right? So it's actually, and in fact, the universals at the level of doing are genuinely universal. Like use of, shall we say, dolls is global, from them. And in fact, Jack mentions it in We Are the Witchcraft, like from the making of little humanoid figures in clay up to a Hollywood voodoo doll. This is a universal attestation of like making images of humans to do bad things to them, right? And that's kind of key. Right. So is it our culture, or is it or is this is kind of what I mean, like it's not your culture, witches of TikTok. It is a universal human practice, and it's that usual kind of middle class Western thing of, even with the best will in the world, accidental appropriation, like appropriating the term witch solely as a middle class white feminist empowerment thing, which it can be, but it's also it's in the doing of Malefica, right? Like that's where we need to situate. So I think we got that. I think so. Intellectually, there is a antecedent to this middle of the 20th century, Gardner and Jack Parsons, which for the purposes of this module, I'm putting Witchcraft Today, which is a whole ass book, and We Are the Witchcraft, which is a essay, something in between an essay and a screed, sort of in dialogue, because they are explicit statements of witch morality in the mid 20th century West, right? So I ordinarily wouldn't, but that's kind of it. And there is an intellectual and lineage antecedent to them, which is witchcraft, as we understand it, historically from Northwest Europe, is inseparable from Malefica specifically. And we find that in the wider context of what I think it's okay to call cunning traditions. How's that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Awesome. All right, next slide, because this is the fun bit, right? So the picture's a little bit blurry. I got up at 5 a.m. to put these slides together because of time differences, but it's from one of Jenks's books on the Thai occult, and that's Ajahn Sueya, and he's spoken about him. Jenks has been on the show a couple of times. Look for the Thai occult if you want to listen to that one. And this is kind of where we get to the universals and the morality of intervention being not as clear cut as taking a picture of a tarot card and a feather and putting it on Instagram as a center left political statement, or calling it our culture. And the reason I picked this image is Ajahn Suya here is calling up graveyard ghosts to do client magic, and it's love magic for a Chinese client. And in fact, if you look at the other images in this book, there's like bowls of blood and other things that he's offering graveyard ghosts, but it's love magic, right? So it's good, but then is it, right? And this, I think when it comes to Malefica and intervention, very often I don't think, like, it's like we're cutting the sandwich on the rectangular rather than the diagonal. Like what we include in it isn't necessarily helpful for navigation, because you can do good things with bothering graveyard ghosts, and you can do, which we know reasonably well, bad things with angels, right? Yeah. And so when we look around the world, it's not just with whom we perform practical enchantment in like a spirit and being sense, but also, and this is key, because coming to the one of the things I find in I guess, contemporary Western magical discourse is a kind of unthinking adoption of the professional get out card from an Afro-Caribbean context, which is, and this is true, like if you go to Haiti and pay a sorcerer to curse your wife so you can run off and marry your lover, you assume, the word isn't quite right, but like you assume that quote unquote karma yourself, and the sorcerer is merely the tool. So the sorcerer will tell you like this, I'm working for you, this kind of stuff passes through me. And that seems to be where a lot of people in the West who are, dare I say, pro Malefica, situate their morality, the morality of intervention. And there's a couple of problems with that. Is well, the first one is kind of anthropological, which is that morality is situated in a cultural context, which makes it thorny for you to just kind of jump into it for a start. But also, it is not an example of universal practice, whereas the creation of dolls is. So you can make dolls of your wife to get rid of her, and you can run off with your lover, right? Because and justify that in a non-appropriative way, because that is as universal as it can possibly get. But maybe assuming that that morality of intervention is a bit more problematic. Of course, if you pay a Haitian sorcerer to do it, you're probably all right. And the reason I mention that at length is it's not the same around the world. So in Thailand, and I find this weird, who would be a professional sorcerer in Thailand? Because of at least according to Jenks anyway, this is his thoughts on it, because the animist practices of Thai magic occur in an officially Buddhist sense, the karma of doing these things actually sits with the practitioner rather than the client. So and it's not a good deal, right? Because you're in a framework there of almost like punishment-based subsequent lifetimes. And if you specialize in cursing people, well, that kind of sucks. And I mention it because there's no universal morality at the level of using a doll, right? And one of them, I'm throwing this in here with a question mark, my neighbor up the valley, Lee Morgan, when he was on the show, and I put it as a question mark because he kind of said this idly, this isn't him in print, we were just speculating at the end of the show. He's like, I wonder if witchcraft is like an ecosystemic function, like, or if it has a function of removal. And I put that in there because obviously in your dare we say most famous work or most famous essay, there is that sense that witchcraft is a response to despoiling and despoilation, right? So that's my tee up to this. What are your thoughts on the different perspectives on Malefica?
A few things. First, you say that I like Lee's work, which is rare. I don't read a lot of modern witchcraft people, but I kind of like what Lee does. The differences here in terms of like the blowback from cursing, which is kind of probably the most important thing for a practitioner to consider. I find it depends on the kind of work you're doing and what protocols you have in terms of how clean your hands stay with it. So if I'm working cold, then I can generally guarantee that I'm not going to have an effect back on me from it. But the problem I find is if you're working cursing and you're working hot, and you're pouring a lot of personal emotional energy into the act, I find that's when you tend to end up with entanglement. I think entanglement is one of the problems that you run into when you're doing this kind of work, particularly because in the West we don't have as developed a system as you would find in properly functional magical communities. I mean, we're still not at that level. So I tend to work cold with my cursing, and I find that more effective. Although there are times when you want to do something which is hot, because of the nature of the work that's required, and then you tend to end up with more entanglement. But I find that entanglement is just one of those things you have to deal with as a magical practitioner, and it's just a reminder that whatever work you're doing, you have to keep your surfaces clean. If you're not keeping your work surfaces clean, then you're going to end up, parasited. You're going to end up with a significant amount of problems. I don't think people spend perhaps quite enough time dealing with those issues.
Malefica is a dish best served cold.
Yeah. But ecosystem removal, absolutely. I've done curse work down here with quite a lot of. I pick up quite a lot of ghost gear from the fishing ships, and I use that against them, which. Yeah, there's materia. There's a lot of materia around that can be used in that suggests its function, and that sends things back to where they belong.
Well, so that's perfect, right? Because I think we can actually get towards a morality of intervention here, which is in fact going to be the next module of landing on it. But we've sort of nailed quite a bit of it here, which is if we look at the idea, let's just say we broadly like. And again, I don't want to put words in his mouth because he just mentioned it on a podcast rather than his books. Broadly like Lee's idea that maybe particularly Malefica is like an ecosystemic response in the same way that bacteria will come and clean up damaged cells in a body. And so the witchcraft, Malefica can be a sort of ecosystemic removal. But if we widen out the how and why of that to what you just said, and using washed up nets and so on is a great example of this. And coming back to the hot and cold thing, co-implication is unavoidable in all magic, right? And this is a real animist thing because you are composed of that in which you are in relation, right? So this is what Malefica isn't, and that's kind of the point. Malefica isn't a separate category. And that's kind of why if you look at this karma stays with the practitioner, karma stays with the client. In both cases, what is universal there, and even with the War of Witches, which I'll come to in a second, is that the consequences remain like in the world, one way or the other.
Yeah.
And that's key, right? So, and this is where, on an operational basis, the difference between hot and cold is energetic for sure, but it's also when you are angry, when you are running hot, you will either make mistakes, bring things up, might be a little bit sloppy. It's the same with anything else, but you're also damaging your own system, right? Like you're kind of running inflamed at that point. So if you have been the victim of injustice, it's almost like the sequence. Well, let me know what you think of this. It's almost like the sequence is I'm extremely angry and inflamed right now. And the process, it's like a triage process of dealing with that on a personal basis, personal energetic basis, and then moving into a cold response afterwards, rather than yelling back, kind of thing. What do you think to that?
Yeah. And again, just developing from that, one of the most useful protocols I find for cursing is using fasting. And using a fasted curse is particularly useful because it does that, because it's you're naturally like removing the inflammation from your body, and you're like dropping all those things out, and you're running pretty clean. So so to curse, so to do a black fast and do like just a water fast and curse at the end of a water fast, that's always a nice thing to do.
Yeah, that's a really good example. The use of cursing makes it easier to be in, I guess, a clearer and cleaner relation to spirits, which is typically, it's very difficult. It is the most common form of cursing, of course, involves like the calling up of things that have malefic capacities to go and mess with someone. Yeah. You can do it yourself, obviously, by energy beam stuff if you want, but it's best to outsource these things, I guess. So that's really helpful. I wanted to because one of the books we're looking at in the course is one of my favorite ever books, A War of Witches. And this is the kind of final piece. So on the Thai side, the results stay with the practitioner. On the Afro-Caribbean side, they stay with the client. And we can't make a universal statement about this is what happens in Mexican witchcraft or curanderismo or brujeria, right? Like this is very specifically Sierra de Puebla in, and if you read A War of Witches, you kind of understand why. It's got a century of politics and land ownership and all that other kind of stuff that implicates, well, that is involved in the indigenous experience of the 20th and 21st century. So it's very specific to there, but it is this idea, and they're really good at it. Like they have really good at cursing people, but their get out is that it will only work if you feed someone to the lords of the underworld. It will only work if your petition is just. And I think that's too easy a get out. Frankly, I think that's too easy a get out, because beings that get used to being fed will keep eating, right? It's sort of like feeding seagulls at the beach with these kind of spirits. And I don't know. And in fact, they kind of say a similar thing towards the end of the book, and we'll be discussing this in the next module if you're watching it. But again, it's another example of the impact or the results of any kind of enchantment, but we are discussing Malefica here. Kind of, they stay in the cosmos, like they are. You are in relation to these beings. Anything else we want to? Anything else from a different perspectives on Malefica that isn't on the slide or whatever that comes to mind? Or example?
Yeah, another thing that I use that I notice a difference with is if I'm working with like disposals. So we have a lot of deep mine shafts here. So if I have someone or something that I need to get rid of, dropping it down a mine shaft again, there's not a lot of attachment or blowback from that. And I don't have to deal with those issues again. But again, these things are always temperament. And for me, I'm looking at outcomes when I'm working cursing. So if I'm furiously angry, that's useful if I'm working with an object. So if I'm working with a doll, for example, I'm working with my pins or whatever, then I find my anger is useful if I want to work that way. But most of the time, because of my background in martial arts, I'm used to running cold. Because I know that I get my outcome if I don't get my blood up, and I simply perform as I'm meant to perform. But also, just looking at the list of things you got here, the other thing is also the discussion that you're having if you're working with a client, in terms of their responsibility and whether they actually want to perform this kind of work. And I think there's a responsibility in the practitioner also to discourage a certain amount of requests, and I'm not sure whether that happens in the modern disconnected online world where people are ordering services from people they're not in relationship or community with.
Yeah. Or jumping on group projects they might find on TikTok, and that's not because, and this is funny, the words I use for magic is straight from Buffy. Spike said this in one episode, and it's literally the best instead of rule of three and the rest of it. Spike says magic has consequences always, right? And that's kind of what we're talking on this slide. That's basically the only actual statement you can make about, well, do I generate karma? Do I blah blah blah? You just say magic always has consequences. Yeah, and so always. If you're jumping on a TikTok curse, that's going to have consequences. So and I think that's really useful to kind of sit with. And coming back to the previous slide about it being our culture, those kind of like really low takes, really dumb low takes, are going to trap you in like a web of relational consequences that are not satisfactory, to say the least, right?
Yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, that's cool. We shall move on to the document of the hour. And in fact, below this video, or linked if you're watching this on YouTube, you will actually have Mr. Gray here reciting said document. But we are on Handsome Jack Parsons, that is, if you don't know. We Are The Witchcraft. Give us a preamble. Like, when did he write it and why?
So this is a text that he produced in 1950. It looks like between 1950 and 1952. This is the final period of Jack's life, although he doesn't realize that this is the case. Obviously, he's performed the Babylon working. He's written the Manifesto of the Antichrist. He's been engaged increasingly in the kind of magical work that he calls witchcraft, much to the chagrin of the OTO adepts who he's been working with. So Jane Wolfe in particular writes to Crowley kind of cautionary letter saying, Jack is enamored with witchcraft and voodoo and, all of these things. And not really happy about what's happening here. So Jack has had a long-term interest in non-high ceremonial magic and have been doing his experiments for some period, but having definitively broken with OTO, having declared himself Antichrist, having taken the oath of the abyss, he spends a couple of years putting his work together, and he produces a range of his kind of like final texts in the last 2 years of his life. And We Are the Witchcraft is one essay in a proposed kind of course of works. He's trying to find an alternative to lodge-based magical work, and so he's putting forward an idea of a secretive group or sodality, and this is kind of a part of a prospectus pointing towards that, where he lays out his ideas for a Babylon-centered witchcraft cult, and restates all of his ideas about the need for individual freedom and the need for sexual liberation, and he encodes quite a lot of information in these very brief and fragmentary texts.
Yeah, quite a lot. We're about to look at it in a second, right? Because, well, so let's talk about it. When he says "we are the witchcraft," the use of the is quite important, because his post-lodge, his experience of what a post-lodge Thelemish magic would look like, he was going to call the witchcraft, and crucially, the way it's post-lodge, I think, has turned out to be true. So this comes back to why, and we are in broad agreement about this, that the Jack is where the current went, right? And so you've sort of in this it's just basically LARPing land if you stay in the lodge model post Jack, and the evidence for that is well, it's in your books, but like the evidence for that is in the subsequent history of what happened, whether it's Scientology and so on, or whether it's the development of all this stuff, and we're going to talk about like Michael Harner's shamanism in a minute, but like the development of what came after Jack shows that Jack was huffing the correct glue, right? And the crucial thing about the witchcraft is, and he writes about it in this, is if you're in the doing of it, you're in it. So it's not, you don't have to send Crowley a few pounds every month via the post for his end-of-life heroin. You can, if you were doing it, you're in it. And that's like way more sophisticated than it might originally look. And it would have been fascinating to see. I probably wouldn't have gone anywhere good, right? Because it's funny that the less you say about an organization that is trans-dimensional and global and existing from the beginning of time, the better it is. I'm sure, just like everything else, it would have ended up being over-described and maybe not even gone very satisfactory places. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's always more. It's left us with more freedom. The fact that he wasn't able to map this out and to make all the mistakes, and we're able to take the spirit of what he was describing, because I think what we recognize in Jack's work is that he has the spirit of the thing, and the spirit of the thing is what we're always after, rather than the letter of the law. And Jack's very good at that when he's being broad and evocative, and he starts to fall over himself a little bit with the detail. But that's because he's an outlier. It's because he's an outlier. He's one of the first people doing it, and he doesn't really have any. He's calling for the others in the same way that with Rune Soup, there's the mission of find the others. Jack's in a period where he's trying to find those people, and
Yeah.
they haven't turned up yet.
Yeah. And well, I think now is a good time to jump into it so that we can, let me just, everyone bear with while I move some stuff around. Cinema layout. Sorry about this. New. Great. All right. Just beginning at the beginning. And what I've done for people is highlight in red the parts that I think are useful from the point of view of situating Malefica and the morality of intervention. Because this is what I was looking for. And the point of this module and why I want it to be quote unquote free, as in out in the world, is I'm just actually, we can do it that way so we can see our lovely faces. Is there's some stuff here that if you sit with will point you in the direction of or will help in, which is the whole point of the course, in the construction of an individualized morality of intervention, or a framework about where we go with it. Because some of the members at the beginning, and this is completely fair because I put the course together, as I mentioned in module 0, protection and Malefica, is I don't think the conversation is healthy one or the other. And some people are like, I will never do Malefica, and that's cool, but it's more how you get to a statement like that is the point of the middle of this course. And there's some stuff here that Jack got, like, bear in mind this is 1950, so this is pre-Gardner, and where I think this is important is pre-Michael Harner, for instance. So Michael Harner and neo-shamanism, because once you get to like the late 60s, early 70s, there is, and it comes out under the term shamanism, right? So it comes out for better and for worse, underneath this Siberian term, are looking at what we might consider universal praxis or universal praxis. And again, Jack kind of got there first, and in a way that isn't, you know, quote unquote shamanism of the sense of being in healing service to a tribe. But he's feeling the right thing here. Like, we are the oldest organization in the world. And this is kind of really powerful stuff. Now, we chatted before I hit the record button that about 20 years before this, a bit more, when Crowley was in New York, no, 20 years, 15 years, he kind of knew or felt that Aiwass, and I write about this in Starships, he kind of felt that Aiwass was Babylonian. Like, he just knew it. But there was no, and he tried different kind of like Kabbalistic ways to get into this idea, right? Because it just sort of felt right. And he's sort of dealing with the late 19th century version of Babylonian history, the real British Museum woolly stuff and what have you. It's not super satisfactory, and it's a feel. And I think Jack has the same thing going on here, where you read this and it's correct on the level of this feels right. We are the oldest organization in the world. We healed the first wound. We comforted the first terror, right? So there's this, what he's looking for is the stuff that people experience, whether they're in a lodge system or not. But maybe if they do experience it in a lodge system, they mistake it for being part of the lodge system. And the Jack's work in its entirety, but something especially like We Are The Witchcraft, is in that jailbreaking sense, which is like, a functional lodge system will deliver it to you, but it is not actually in the lodge system. It is in the current. And that's the kind of key thing here. And this is the bit where I think it's useful. And again, we have to remember this is 1950. And last time you were on the podcast, we were talking about Jack being tremendously influenced by science fiction and pulps and so on. So there's that, there's almost a Lovecraftian excitement at the idea of like mysterious brown cults and drums around fires and the painting of skin and all these kind of things that I cut him some slack. It was 1950, and I do not believe he was a racist. So we would maybe write this differently 70 years later. But you feel where he's going with it. In China and the Yucatan, all organizations have known us. No organization is of us. When there is too much organization, we depart. Now, I think that's kind of crucial. But when we get to, we're on the side of man, of life, and of the individual, therefore we are against religion, morality, and government. Therefore, our name is Lucifer. We are on the side of freedom, of love, of joy, and laughter, and divine drunkenness. Therefore, our name is Babylon. So this is, again, pre-Gardner, pre-shamanism, and I think electrifying. In situating a current that, quote unquote, we can step into that is in global relation. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, it's it's very proto-psychedelic as well. I mean, the entire piece feels very much like the kind of experience that many people will have the first time they take a very powerful psychedelic. This sense of like timelessness, and like the details may be off, but the feeling is absolutely bang on. You know,
Yeah.
he's yeah.
And it's funny you mentioned that, right? Because he was on his way to Mexico when he did get blowed up, right? And so he would have ended up meeting, I think, Maria Sabina. She's the Mazatec curandera who first gave Algodonwasan mushrooms and so on, because he's sort of in that world where you in that kind of like beat world, or he would have been, like, because he knew enough kind of people on that side, West Coast. So it's just interesting that if he didn't get blown up, that you mentioned psychedelics, because I actually think he would have encountered them at scale in like an indigenous context, and then would have been cooking with gas.
Yeah.
Anyway, but so why I lit this one up is not just because it's good for situating it globally, but coming back to that morality of intervention, is the morality of intervention relies on, and this is the invitation of We Are the Witchcraft, in seeing the witch at the end of the pointed figure, like to actually go, well, what is my, it predates politics, so it's not necessarily fair to say what is the political framework of intervention. But what he's actually saying here is that it is antinomian, it is anti-authoritarian. That is, the current is, as you mentioned, like on the outside. And that's sort of crucial when we look, coming back to jumping on an Instagram curse, coming back to like, well, am I actually involving myself in the total machine of my enslavement by emotionally entangling with it? And is that the correct place to intervene? And I mean, obviously the answer to that, I think, is no, but it's kind of here with Jack going like, well, what is the witchcraft, and what is its what are its rules of intervention? And that's kind of there, right? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And again, I because this is one of the things, bless him, he did his best, but so much of his stuff is, because he was so enamored of Crowley, his own sort of version of it. And in this case, it's inventing his own names for people, like Demolensis, like Demole, Joan of Arc. It's just you look at this and go, I'm just reading Crowley here, right? When he lists the people who are of the witchcraft, which again is clearly an idea he gets from the Gnostic Mass, but for the same reason, which is these, you are in a lineage. If you are in the witchcraft, you are in a lineage, and that's a big kind of point, I think, of this and the module. What do you think?
Yeah, completely. This is all a lot of this. When you, if you have a background in Thelema, you can see that this is like a rereading and a kind of like rescuing of the best bits of Crowley that he possibly can. As you say, that bit straight out the Gnostic Mass, and there's a few bits we're going to come to further on as well, which contain that. The other thing to note is that the text contains quite a lot of cut-ins from Liber 49. So in terms of the text that this is in discourse with, this is the closest you get to kind of an exegesis on Liber 49 from Jack. He starts to like return to that material. And one of the interesting things I've thought about is there are 4 lines missing in the Book of Babylon at the start, and I always wonder whether perhaps those lines are preserved in one of these essays and mentioned in some way, but it's impossible to tell, unfortunately.
No. Yeah, there's like a little Jurassic Park invitation in there of splicing. Yeah, it's true. And this is kind of, again, the whole point of this module, because it's a great document. If this is new to you, of course, well, you can read it because we've got it up here and find it online, or you can watch the video of Peter, or do both. But from the point of view of the morality of intervention, what I want is, what is a universally available framework for the quote unquote West that is in dialogue with the world, that you can step into, that provides, justification isn't the right word. It provides a way of dialogue and being in relation to opportunities for engagement. Because that's the bit I think people, if you aren't in an initiatory lineage of one kind or another, we're like sort of at sea, and it's quite important because the reason we discussed the bits at the beginning and the historical context of witchcraft and Malefica in a cunning sense is that you can't say cursing, I'm a witch and cursing is part of my culture. You can't say that without getting this stuff right. So these are the bits that I've highlighted moving forward. And I love it because here was where we step into, is a wolf doing Malefica or a great white shark? And this is crucial. Sort of sitting there, if you squint back at what Lee was saying on the previous slides, and when the howl of the wolf echoes in the forest of your night, know that there are those who also prowl, and when the ways of your fellows about you seem the ways of idiocy and madness, hello 2022, know that there are also those who have seen and judged and acted. And this is where I think there's my favorite moral statement of intervention is this one. It's the morality of the wolf's intervention. What do you think?
Yeah, completely. You have to shift to that understanding. If you live in a universe where you're angry at the wolf, then there's something significantly wrong with you. And for you, with your relationship diving and your understanding of sharks, I mean, yeah, this is nature. And like, if you're practicing witchcraft, then you have to accept all of those things. You have to accept those things in yourself. And I think one of the problems that we've seen in the modern internet culture is that people have completely fled from the shadow. And as a result of fleeing from their own shadows, they projected those shadows onto everyone else.
Yes, absolutely.
We need to come into that right relation. We need to go back to that understanding that we contain all of these potentialities.
Yeah. Both of those things are very Babylonian, right? Like as in BABA, because it's, if you project those shadows onto someone, that's quite Babylonian in the sense of like the holy whore receiving infinite insults, but it is also having to do that kind of shadow work, which ties in with literally what he's saying here, like, because it's a forest of your night, right? And so when you're in that moment, know that there are others who have seen and judged and acted. So when this, in the confrontation with the shadow in the forest of your night, that night is populated with us, with the witchcraft, right? It's like, the more I read it, I go, this is in fact an amazing document. I'm glad we're doing this.
This is also one of the it's one of the symbols that Jack uses quite a lot. I think he's taken the witchwood idea. He uses you shall wander in the witchwood under the night of Pan, and he uses these images quite a lot. I think he's taken it from I think it's John Buchanan, who wrote a novel called The Witchwood, and I think he's drawn on that. And the more you look at Jack, the more you find that both the science fiction and the kind of like fabulous literature of the time, this kind of like imaginal world that's kind of exploded in the pulps, has really kind of like saturated into his imagination, because he's stranded from the mythic Europe that a lot of his imagery is kind of like drawn from. And I think he also sees Cameron very much in this sense because of her Scots-Irish heritage. I think he feels that he has this link back to the old Europe that you find that kind of suffuses his work.
Yeah, and that's quite important. And for premium members who do any of our regular journeying work, the forest of your night is one of those tributaries into, I think we mentioned it in the last course, into a lot of the group journeying work we do. The place in which it's done is effectively the witchwood. And the witchwood, in his understanding at this point, right? So there was in the early 20th century, and it's actually, it informs Tolkien, right? This idea that isn't biologically correct, but it's almost like it's psychologically correct, that Europe was once covered by a forest that basically went the whole way along the sort of the beginning of the Arctic region, all the way across Europe and into Russia and into Britain, and kind of like a almost like a monk's haircut around the planet, but that Europe was once one great forest, and that's where Mirkwood and some of that stuff, which by the time Tolkien was writing, it was sort of known that that's not quite correct, and we had ideas of glaciation and so on. But the witchwood and Mirkwood is this profound psychological idea of a dark, infinite forest of European antiquity, and that's it's potent as a place to be in relation to, I think is what I want to say there. Nice one. And this again, coming back to, and again, this is one of the mid 20th century, let's cut this guy some slack. And in fact, I'm recording with Carl Abramson. So depending on when you're watching this, regarding Anton LaVey for similar reasons. There's some overly essentializing parts with that 7 years later we might describe differently. But again,
but you're missing something. Yeah, you're missing something with that. So,
yeah.
The reason that we have what like now fashionably gets called essentializing is that he's hiding in here the sex magical teachings of OTO. So when he's saying, lift up your hearts, I'm a man, or I am a woman, and the power of life is mine. He does this right the way through this piece. He's talking about the secret of the ninth degree. So he's technically describing the sex magical working, which is at the core of it. And although you would expect within a witchcraft tradition for there also to be more non-reproductive sexual and like other sexual combinations within it, he's really concerned with the sexual mystery of the ninth degree here.
Yeah, good. Because I'm of the opinion he was a little bit bi.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, completely. Yeah. There's enough. There are enough people around him who point out that Jack was bisexual, and certainly, there are so many people who say that it has to be a fact, but whether he was actively bisexual, we don't know. Yeah, there's only one person who claimed to have sex with him, and everyone says he's a liar. So
yeah. So all right, and so kind of getting to it. I think I've got more red. Yes. Moving into. A couple of things I should have maybe put this in red. In fact, I will, because this is a live document. What fun. You can watch me work. Our way is not for all men. Now, this is the other part of that I think is crucial when it comes to formulating one's own morality of intervention, if you're magically operant, is that it doesn't need to be, you're not starting a country. You're not like, you're not actually like decreeing laws that 20 million people need to follow. And that's crucial. So the difference between like, oh, well, so you just think people should murder one and the other. It's like, no, it's not at the level that this works. When you are, when you're in that forest of your own night and you're in relation to wolves and sharks and so on, it doesn't fit neatly into human laws. And that's kind of crucial when people are like, well, I would never run someone over with my car. And you're cool. Probably I wouldn't either. That it's almost like it's not that it's not part of the discussion, but the way of, in this case, the witchcraft is not a universal path. And that's why I think this is this is why it's clearly Jack in his post-Thelema phase this is the opposite of where Crowley was going, which is like, I might start a world religion. Jack's like, no, the witchcraft isn't for everyone.
Yeah, and Jack's actually seen it. I mean, because he's been in the only functioning OTO lodge on the planet, and what he's seen is that the people who turn up don't do the fucking work, and are largely a waste of time. So one of the reasons that he's changed things from if you turn up and someone signs a piece of paper, then they'll initiate you, is he's found out that that's not an effective way to do things.
No.
And I think it's important for practitioners to say, yes, our way is not the way for all men or all women. You know, this is magic and witchcraft. You know, and if you're not prepared to take that self-responsibility for yourself, then this probably isn't the place for you to be playing.
Yes, agreed. And that is absolutely the point of the middle of this course. And literally that's fine, right? Because there's and there are other ways to be powerful in the world, I think is how I want to say that, right? So, but if you are of the witchcraft, this is what it looks like, I think, is important. And it's not, and don't attempt to break the witchcraft by saying, no, it isn't. Find where you are powerful differently. And that can be other lineages, other systems, and so on. And I think, and that's the bit that I've always, especially over the last couple of years, because then I read the sentence that after the one that I've just put in red. There are those who are so constricted and sick in themselves that the thought of their own freedom is a horror and that of others a fierce pain, so that they would enslave all men. Hello, the last 2 years, right? And in fact, the people and some of the loudest voices promoting it think they're in the witchcraft. And those you should shun, or if you must, destroy them, as you will know how. For this also is bounty. And there's something about this is, again, Crowley says the same thing, right? Like, this is Book of the Law, which is if you are, the one sin is restriction, right? And that's, again, speaking of Anton LaVey, he's downstream from both of these things, although I don't know how much he knew about Jack Parsons in 1966, but he certainly knew about Crowley. And this idea that, and there's something, it's politically situated in a mid-20th century America where libertarianism and libertinism both still had teeth, right? And neither of which do at the moment. But I think you either have to be post-anarchist. I think you have to be post-anarchist to find that now. But the whole point when they're talking about is like the thing that breaks the laws of the universe is to restrict the flourishing of life. And both Crowley and Jack make no bones about that being the case. And indeed, although it isn't, like, it's described with complete violence, like literally, if your freedoms are restricted, destroy the people who are restricting them. Is just cut and dry. That's it. That is kind of implied in, I would say, I've just written a book about this, so bracketing the term animist cosmovisions around the world, because it's the shadow side of what it means to be a human, and a human as a custodian, which is one of the things that makes us fully human, is our capacity to be custodial, to allow the flourishing and to facilitate the flourishing of all life around us, human life and non-human life. And that's a statement of how we are in relation to our local biosphere. That's a statement of how we're in relation to the spirit world. And the whole kind of point of that is we exist, speaking of Tolkien, this is sort of what the elves are for as well. Like, we exist to, our cosmic role is to participate in and facilitate as much as we can the mutual flourishing of the more than human world. And whilst that, and this is the shadow side of that, which is like, if you are restricting flourishing, you must go. Right. And that's kind of key.
And again, I think it's important to note that this is also part of the heritage of Nietzsche. So a lot of the ideas that we're seeing here is the kind of paganism that Nietzsche was moving us towards. And also another little quick note, I was talking with Alcestis about this the other day, is that Jack was moving into an America which had, the rise of McCarthyism, which had increasing kind of restraints on people's individual freedoms and sexual freedoms. And we live in an infinitely more restricted society than the one that Jack is fighting against here. But the society we live in now, the people who are doing the most shouting are supposedly the most virtuous. And those are the people who you must shun or destroy them. Because otherwise, these constricted, sick people will destroy everyone else.
And that is absolutely true. And it is the witchcraft. This is it. We're just going to jump back to the top of the freaking essay. This is what he's saying at the beginning here. We have always been here doing this. We have always been here on the side of life and against the side of various powers of church and state and restriction, whether they cloak themselves in morality or not. And you're right. It's all it's Nietzsche, Crowley, Jack in that attitude. And the creepy thing is, because again, Carl Abramson just had a book come out with Inner Traditions, which is his biography of Anton LaVey, and looking at the world that Anton LaVey built his church almost like as a project of the witchcraft against. Ours is worse. He actually had fewer restrictions to fight against than where we are now. And I'm not a Church of Satan Satanist, but I'm like, well, they better get their not in a judgy way, better get their act together, because there's more work to be done. It's really interesting, right? So he in the early 70s in San Francisco could keep a lion, and managed to keep a lion for several years in his basement and take it for walks along the cliffs before he eventually had to give it to the zoo. San Francisco today, you can't even arrest people for like ram raiding a Walgreens. Like
Yeah.
the rules of what you can and can't do are insane. And you have to like check in with surveillance devices to buy a coffee. He could keep a lion. I don't think people realize it's gotten worse, and the witchcraft calls you to do something about that. At the very least, shun, right?
Yeah.
Nice. All right, so that's the final bit. I'll also kind of, this is a nice way to end it, right? Rather does the power often show the most where conflict rages since at any time, and especially in a false civilization, the way must be won through. So this is one of the, again, eerily predictive and optimistic ways to end. He wrote this in 1950, and it is a letter to 2022 about like, you have to, like, it's going to get, this is a false civilization, and this power, I think, does show, and this is almost Jungian, when the restrictions and the kind of archonic forces, or whatever you want to call them, as they level up, so must we, and so do we. But like, Jung would say that any like powerful arrival of an archetype also summons its opposite, and we're living through that at the moment, and it's a question of which one I think you step into. And in this case, like, we may, it's not quite right, but we may consider, like, say, the forest, the witchwood may be an archetype, but like, stepping into the witchcraft rather than, I don't know, the technocracy is basically what he's talking about here, without realizing that that's what he's talking about. All right. So what do we do with this? We've got to the end of the document and the final discussion. Let me just bring us back. What do we do with this, our document? If people are magically operant in some way, or even if they're not, even if they are philosophically kissing cousins to magic. But I guess we'll start with the operant. Here's this declaration of the witchcraft from 1950. What should we do with it?
Well, I think the first thing to say is like, do you recognize yourself in this? Is this a text which is talking to you? Because, as Jack says, this is for the few, and I'm very aware that the work that I do to many people can seem quite extreme, but it's not something that I'm trying to force on a single other human being. It's a question of discovering what the work is that you're chosen to do and what your witchcraft should look like. But your witchcraft is going to be functioning in the world that Jack describes. And I think it's very important to see that he was arguing for this radical vision of freedom, this absolute freedom, at times in ways that I think are difficult. But that spirit, that feeling, if you can't find that in your blood, then this isn't the work for you to do. And if you can't see that our culture has become so extremely poisoned that you need to do something about it, then you need to wake the fuck up, because we're in a very dangerous time. On the day that we're recording this today, we've seen Vladimir send the tanks in. Well, this is because the West is falling. The West is transforming. And as the West transforms as witches, we have something to do with this. We have something to offer here and something to change, because I can tell you for nothing that the people out there who believe that Biden-style leftism is going to triumph are in for a very, very rude awakening, because the backlash we're going to face from the forces of repression is going to be mighty. And you're going to need people on your side who, at the present time, you're calling fascists, transphobes, what are the other meaningless hate words that are thrown around at the moment, white supremacists. All of this language is the nonsense language of division. If you read this document and you recognize yourself within it as one of the witchcraft, then you have a duty to do the work and to connect with the others around you, not to engage in an endless witch hunt and a purity death spiral. So I think the radicalism of Jack is something that we should look at and go, why the hell aren't we seeing that manifesting in more people now? And we need to bring that through.
I think that's perfect. I think there's nothing to add to that other than that's exactly it. And it is stark, but it is the witchcraft. What did you think it was going to be, right? And it's a really potent thing that he brought through. It blew him up, and that's what it is. How do people? What do you think? Last question, because I don't want to. I want to leave people with what you just said because I think it's very important. But where do they go next if they're like, oh shit, I am the witchcraft? What would you have them read or do next?
I can recommend they pick up a copy of my Apocalyptic Witchcraft, as that's one of the few texts that I think really takes kind of some of the trajectories of Jack forward into the future. I obviously, I being European, I feel bad about promoting my own work, but I think if this work speaks to you, then that might be an interesting place for you to start.
Love it. If you didn't, I would have done it for you. So that's exactly where I want to go with that. But this has been amazing, and thank you so much for this. And I'm sure the people, because this is one of the public modules, people will be very grateful for you giving us your extremely valuable and profound insight on this amazing document and invitation and clarion call, for like an eternal clarion call. So thank you very much, Peter. This has been wonderful. And yes, for people who want to know more, everything that you need is linked up below.
Perfect. Thank you, Gordon. A pleasure spending time with you.